I will focus initially on the specific ways that feminist principles inspired women and men to improve women's lives.
So are we to assume then, even after women have secured more rights under the law than men, that focusing solely on the lives of women was a good thing, and it continues to be a good thing for society? I mean, I hope you're aware that men and children do in fact exist. Let's continue.
These are the direct effects of feminism. Near the end, I will review what I call the indirect or knock-on effects by enumerating a few of the ways men have benefited from feminism as a set of values and from feminist activism.
Well, I guess it's nice to be included as an afterthought. But anyway, what you say is interesting. You say there's a few ways that men have benefited from feminism. I wonder, though, if you're going to address how men, women, and children have also been harmed by feminism. Or when you do your measurements, do you do so using a one-armed scale? Just curious. Moving on.
In answering yes to the question, is feminism good for the world, I will address the common objection framed as yes, but.
So what are you saying here? We just have to accept that, yes, feminism is good for the world because someone else said, yes, but? No evidence, no argument as to the yes. We're only going to get evidence and argument as to the but. So you're here to dispel all reservations and all negativity regarding feminism, but I have a stinking suspicion that you're not going to do any of that. You're just going to pile on the yes, and you're not going to address the but. Anyway, we'll see. This ought to be interesting. Moving on.
To do so, I'm going to borrow shamelessly from the comedian Louis C.K., who talks about categories of things he calls, of course, but maybe, to describe his ambivalent comportment to certain social phenomena.
Can't wait.
It goes like this. Of course the world needed first-wave feminism, generally seen as focusing on women's disadvantages in civil and political equality. Note 4.
Okay, so let's take a look at Note 4. This book, if we are to believe all the commentaries on Amazon.com, is a primer. It basically reviews feminist figures from the UK. As one reviewer put it, quote, "It is only a set of bios about English feminists and proto-feminists," unquote. It doesn't even argue the case for feminism. So to prove your claim that the world needed first-wave feminism generally, and that was seen as focusing on women's disadvantages and civil and political equality, you cite a book that doesn't look at the ultimate question. Rather, it merely cites some feminists and feminist prototypes. Who would have thunk that at least one of the first-wave feminists was focused on civil and political equality? That's all that you've managed to show at this point. You haven't proved shit. You haven't proved, of course, it was needed. You haven't even laid out a scrap of evidence in support of your position at all. You only prove that some old-timey feminist thought it was needed. Your argument, your proof, so far is a fucking circular argument. It's goddamn ridiculous. You're saying somebody thought feminism was needed, therefore it was needed. That's a fucking high school mistake, and you're pretending to be a scholar? Again, let's take a look at your degree. Ah, that's right. It's an affirmative action degree. That explains quite a lot here. Anyway, a scholar takes in the whole body of evidence available on a subject and deals with all of the criticism, and they deal with it with empiricism first, logical argument next. That's how scholars do it. What you are doing is merely being a fucking harpy. Congratulations, you're a fucking harpy. And the thing is, we know that movements that operate under the pretext of solving a problem often make it worse. This is repeated throughout history. But let's just take one such example. Communists thought communism would make the lives of the working class better. Everywhere it's been tried, it's failed to do so. Every single communist effort has ended in ruin and or poverty. East Germany, the Soviet Union, Cuba, And presently we're looking at the implosion of Venezuela. And now let me draw out the analogy a little bit further. Think about communism in Russia and China. Both of these nations turned their fortunes around when they decided they had to attract and reward capitalist investment. Under your theory, you are saying that communism was good because, hey, look, Russia and China, they're doing great compared to how they were in 1920 and 1980, completely fucking glossing over the problem that communism caused in the first place. That's a fucking ridiculous argument. The same holds true for feminism. No one is denying that in 1850 women largely didn't have the right to vote. But hey, a lot of men didn't either. If you take history and put it on a time scale and you see the separation between working men getting the right to vote and working women getting the right to vote, it's just a sliver, a moment in time. Universal suffrage for men barely preceded universal suffrage for women. Moreover, the argument has been made that first-wave feminists actually delayed the process of universal suffrage because of their zealotry. And even if first-wave feminists sped up universal suffrage, you would have to show that universal suffrage is good, and therefore it should be placed on the scale of whether or not feminism is a good thing. But that's just one piece of evidence. To say that feminism is good due to one piece of evidence where you assume two preconditions that don't necessarily follow, well, that's just fucking ludicrous from the get-go. So let's put a pin in this, and maybe you'll come back to it so we can decide if it should go on the scales or not. Moving on.
Girls and women should be educated and have access to higher education. And the 19th century Europeans who derided the idea of women's education were as wrong and bigoted as the Taliban and other fundamentalists who preach against educating girls, Malala's campaign being the most famous example of the fight to educate girls, are today. That's note 5.
I'm really at a loss how to respond to all that gobbledygook. You cite, in support of that, this story about Malala, as if that somehow proves the value of feminist ideology. The only thing that story tends to prove is that Islam oppresses women. It doesn't really have much to say about whether feminism is good or not. It only informs us as to Islam. I mean, fuck. This is why I call you Shaman Winterflake. There's no science behind your positions. There's no logical foundations for your positions. All you have is reasons. And the rest of this? Well, curiously enough, that's a lot to unpack. First off, you just gloss over this idea as if working class men had access to higher education throughout history. What you classify as a gender problem is so narrow-minded, it's absolutely fucking absurd. But then again, I guess I should expect narrow-mindedness from a shill with an affirmative action degree. As with the right to vote, we can't tell from your evidence whether it was the Enlightenment ideology and or modernization that has been driving access to education. In fact, maybe even Marxism had more to do with universal access than feminism. It just does not follow that since feminists were advocating for more access to education for women, that it was achieved because of feminism. Nor does it follow that getting universal access to education was hastened by feminism. Nor does it mean in the balance that this hastening was worth all the crap that came along with feminism. Shaman Winterflake, your proposition is non sequitur. You're just running on the assumption that there are no consequences of universal access to education. One might argue that educated idiots like you have done more to reverse social progress rather than to bring about positive change in the first place. And so we can't put education on the scale as of yet. But we'll hold your proposition over here in limbo. Maybe, just maybe, you'll come back and prove this at some point.
Of course, women should be equal citizens in law.
In this I agree, but I can't put this on the scale as to whether or not feminist ideology and activism was ever or is the best vehicle to bring about this, considering all the baggage that feminism carries with it. Equality under the law was already being driven by the Enlightenment principles and modernization. Nothing you have shown suggests empirically or logically that feminism helped or hindered this process, whether in the past or going forward into the future. Advocating for women's rights separate from men's rights to achieve equality for everyone is a system doomed to fail from the very start. For whatever good feminism may or may not have done for women, it's sexist, segregationist. It's an ideology that has an adversarial approach towards men and family and altruism and compromise. The very concept of it is divisive. And how could baking divisiveness into society be good for a society? You're going to have to prove that proposition because it just does not make sense. Moving on.
And feminist women and their male allies who worked to reform voting laws, laws that denied women the right to their own earnings, inheritance laws, and reform of 19th century divorce laws were right.
Well, let's take a look at the reformation of voting laws. Given that Western culture appears to be on the path of surrendering itself to authoritarian culture, such as fascism or Islam, can we say that everyone having the vote is necessarily a good thing? Many have noted that once the populace learns it can vote to itself the nation's treasure, that nation is doomed. And women tend to vote for more and more benefits to themselves, as you derp about in your own thesis. Once more, women tend to vote against a nation's own self-interests. The end result very likely being a failed nation state, followed with blood in the streets, followed by an authoritarian state. And all of this may very well come to pass because we had voters that refused to weigh costs with benefits, refused to pay attention to our long-term financial security and to our borders. This may be directly a result of universal suffrage. It turns out that perhaps limited suffrage, such as only letting the heads of households with positive income vote, would lead to a sustainable, egalitarian nation-state. At any rate, Shaman Winterflake, your presuppositions are not worth taking as fact. And what's really weird here is that you cited Malala's story to back up your claims. You did not cite anything regarding the laws to denying women the right to their own earnings, inheritance laws, or divorce laws. So you've really not made any sort of case as to whether or not things are better now than before these reforms, let alone that the good of these changes is attributable to feminism and that the bad of these changes is attributable to something else. The fact of the matter, our divorce laws are in a terrible state at this point in time. Alimony, child support, and government benefits all incentivizing single-parent households. And all of these things incentivize what we know to be, for a fact, something that is very detrimental to society. We know that on average, children thrive best in two-parent households. In fact, having a traditional father and mother household is the best situation of all. So it's not given that society is better off with the reforms in divorce law overall anyway. So since you made these points, you basically put out a challenge for anti-feminists to prove feminism is bad. However, in order to do that, you imply that we have to jump through all sorts of steps to prove it. The fact of the matter is, no, we don't. We're not the ones running around claiming that we're academics and scientists and we can prove all of this scientifically. That's you. You're the academic. Feminism has been a theory now for 50 years. It's had academia at its disposal for 30 of those years anyway. And you can't prove your fucking case. If feminists could prove it, it would be wrapped up in one book. All of the theories, all of the predictions would have come true. Yeah, it would be all in one book, and all of the science there that backs it would be all there, and it would be proven. You can't prove your case with all of your resources. All of you educated idiots have been running around trying to prove this very thing for all these fucking years, and you can't prove it. There's a reason you can't prove it. It's because you're fucking wrong. Almost everywhere we turn, we see your theory being disproven. Women can't lie, disproven. Women aren't violent, disproven. Female cooperative leadership being better than male leadership, disproven. Women-led societies being peaceful, disproven. Women being as good as men in combat, disproven. The wage gap, for fuck's sake, disproven. And the most retarded claim that you have made, the dumbest one that you have made, the one that pulls at our hearts, the one that we want to believe, but the one that is actually the stupidest of all your claims, that women are inherently equal to men, that has been disproven. If women were equal to men, you wouldn't need to have been protected and led by men for all of human history. Your claim has been disproven. Yes, men and women should be equal under the law. No argument. Yes, women should have opportunities that men have. No argument. Men and women should cooperate. They should work together to better their society. No argument. Men and women should complement each other, and that this is the basis of mankind's success. No fucking argument. But this nonsense claim that women are as capable as men to lead and build and create is fucking nonsense. Where is the proof of this? This claim that men are as nurturing and as social as women is fucking nonsense. That's not to say there's no overlap. That's not to say that women can't be artists, they can't be engineers, and they can't be leaders, and they can't be generals, they can't be admirals. That's not what I'm saying. We're not saying that there's no overlap. We're not saying that there should be artificial barriers in place to preclude women from being these things and for men from being house dads. No, that's perfectly fine. But these blanket claims that feminists have been making are utter fucking drivel. They have not been proven. They have been disproven. You have had a millennia to prove your case in the observable world, and you haven't. You have had 50 years of feminist theory to prove your case, and you got everything, virtually everything wrong. Men and women are fucking different. So you take your stupid fucking challenge and you jam it right back up the twat it came out of. You are fucking ridiculous.